Have you ever wondered why religion became so powerful, lasting through thousands of years, shaping entire civilizations, and even deciding who ruled and who obeyed? People often think religion started because humans were curious about life, death, or the mysteries of the universe. But if you look closely at history, another story emerges. Religion was never just about belief. It was about power, about control. Think about it: when societies grew too large to manage with brute force alone, leaders needed something stronger than swords or spears. They needed an invisible tool, something that lived inside people's minds. And religion became that tool. If people were taught that their king was chosen by the gods, or that their suffering in this world would earn them rewards and another rulers could govern without constant violence, words replaced whips. Loyalty replaced fear. In ancient Mesopotamia, their earliest kings didn't just demand obedience, they demanded loyalty. And the way they got it was by claiming they were chosen by the gods. In Egypt, pharaohs went even further. They weren't just rulers. They were believed to be divine themselves. That meant disobedience wasn't only rebellion, it was blasphemy. And this pattern repeats across cultures. Men in power shape religion to protect their authority. Priesthoods became closed circles using rituals and languages ordinary people couldn't understand. That made everyone dependent on them. If only the priest could read the sacred texts, then only he could tell you what the gods wanted. That gave religious leaders incredible leverage, not just over spiritual questions, but over daily life laws, morality, and survival itself. In Rome, emperors weren't satisfied with political dominance. They became gods after death, and eventually during their lifetimes too. That wasn't about personal faith, it was about locking power into place. The same thing happened in China with the mandate of heaven. If an emperor ruled wisely, he had heaven's blessing. If famine or rebellion struck, that blessing was said to be withdrawn. Religion wasn't standing outside politics, it was politics. So the real question is, did religion rise from pure spirituality, or was it carefully molded into a tool of control from the very beginning? When we trace the rise of laws and justice systems, it's impossible to separate them from religion. In fact, some of the very first legal codes in human history were framed as divine commandments. Take the Ten Commandments, or the Code of Hammurabi, or later on Islamic Sharia. These weren't just moral teachings handed down from heaven. They were social contracts that carried the weight of divine authority. And that authority was rarely neutral. It mostly protected the powerful. Think about it. Religious laws didn't simply say, be good to one another. They included strict rules about property taxes, inheritance, land, and speech. They often punished the poor more harshly, while giving the wealthy, the kings or the priests, an extra layer of protection. Women's roles were tightly restricted. Questioning leaders or sacred traditions could be treated as both a crime and a sin. Religion didn't just give people guidance, it locked in a hierarchy. By the Middle Ages, that hierarchy became even clearer. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was a political empire. Popes commanded armies. They formed alliances with kings crowned emperors, and even had the power to excommunicate rulers who stood in their way. That wasn't religion working in the background, it was religion acting as a government of its own. And when we hear about the Crusades, the image that often comes to mind is soldiers marching under holy banners, driven by faith. But peel back the surface and you'll find land grabs, trade routes, and political rivalry hiding underneath. Religion provided the excuse, the rallying cry. But the real prize was power and territory. The same pattern shows up with the Inquisition. Officially, it was about purity of faith. In practice, it was about eliminating threats to the church's authority. Torture, executions, public trials, these weren't about finding truth. They were about enforcing obedience. So when people talk about religion in history, it's easy to think of faith, community, or meaning. But the deeper story is one of politics dressed in sacred clothing. Over and over again, religion gave rulers the ultimate weapon, not just control of land or armies, but control of belief itself. And when you control belief, you don't just rule people's bodies, you rule their minds. When European powers began expanding overseas, religion once again marched at the front lines, not just armies. Colonization wasn't only military conquest, it was spiritual warfare. Missionaries often arrived before soldiers. They baptized local people, taught them obedience, and prepared the ground for control. In the Americas, this was especially brutal. Native communities were told their gods were false, their traditions sinful, and their cultures inferior. Churches were built on top of sacred sites, sometimes by force. Conversion wasn't simply about saving souls. It was about breaking old identities and replacing them with loyalty to a new empire. You weren't just saved, you were subdued. This tactic wasn't unique to the Americas. Across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, colonizers wrapped their political ambitions in the language of salvation. If you resisted, you weren't just defying foreign rulers, you were defying God. That turned rebellion into blasphemy. And with that kind of framing, empires didn't need to rely on violence alone. Faith itself became a leash. Even today, echoes of this history remain. Many political leaders still use religious language to justify laws, policies, and authority. In some countries, scriptures are treated as the foundation of legal systems, and questioning those laws isn't just dissent, it's labeled immoral or even criminal. When a law is declared to come from God, debate shuts down before it can even begin. But look closer, and you'll see the same underlying pattern: religion serving as a shield for power. Kings ruled by divine right. Colonizers spread civilization through forced conversions. Modern politicians cloak themselves in sacred words. Again and again, belief was turned into a strategy. And let's not forget the role of wealth. Throughout history, many religious leaders were not humble servants, but landowners, politicians in robes, men who controlled property, collected taxes, and lived in palaces while their followers struggled. When peasants starved, they were told to pray harder. When they asked why the rich kept getting richer, they were warned that questioning the divine order was dangerous. This wasn't pure faith, it was fear carefully shaped and maintained by those at the top. And the trick worked because religion wasn't just about the divine, it was about hierarchy. God at the top, then leaders, then everyone else. To challenge the leaders was to challenge God. And that is one of the most powerful control systems ever created. Some people argue, but religion helps people. It brings comfort, community, and meaning. And yes, sometimes it does. But that doesn't erase how it's been used as a weapon of control. Just because something can do good doesn't mean it hasn't done harm. We don't judge a system only by its best moments, we also look at the damage it's caused. And when it comes to religion, history is packed with violence, coercion, and political games. Think of the countless reformers, scientists, and thinkers who were silenced or punished. Their so-called crime. Often not heresy, but simply asking the wrong questions. Questions that threatened the people in charge. Galileo wasn't dangerous because he looked at the stars. He was dangerous because his discoveries undermined church authority. Again and again, religion reacted harshly to change, not because truth was under attack, but because power was. And when belief systems are used to defend power, they stop being about truth altogether. They become barriers to thought. Religion often teaches people to submit not just spiritually but socially. Don't question, don't doubt, have faith. These are useful lessons if you're the one in charge. You don't want citizens asking too many questions. You want them to accept the order as it is because that order benefits you. That's why so many religious institutions throughout history demanded obedience. They created hierarchies where God was at the top, leaders claimed to speak for him, and everyone else was expected to follow. If you challenged those leaders, you weren't just challenging men, you were accused of challenging the divine itself. That's not spirituality. That's manipulation dressed as holiness. And notice how often religious rules align with protecting privilege. Rules about women being silent, rules about inheritance that favored the wealthy, rules about speech that kept dissenters quiet. They weren't written by gods. They were written by men with something to lose. And those men disguised their fear of change as eternal wisdom. Even the idea of the afterlife played into this. If you can convince people that they'll get their reward after death, then they're easier to control in this life. Tell the poor they'll be rich in heaven. Tell the suffering that it's just a test. That way, no system needs fixing, only obedience is required. And fear of eternal punishment kept millions in line. If you take a closer look, even religions that claim to preach love often build strict hierarchies. And those hierarchies aren't built on kindness, they're built on obedience, silence, and guilt. That's not an accident. That's by design. Think about how sacred texts came to be. They weren't just preserved word for word from some divine moment. They were edited, selected, and censored by councils and priestly elites. Some books were left out. Others were rewritten. Whole theologies were shaped not only by revelation, but by political decisions about what was useful and what was dangerous. Look at how the Bible was compiled, or how the Quran was collected, or how Hindu scriptures passed through priestly castes. These weren't just spiritual moments, they were power plays. And what happened to those who offered a different message, reformers? Mystics, rebels? Many were branded heretics, cast out or killed. Not always because their ideas lacked value, but because they threatened the system. Again, the issue wasn't truth, it was control. People sometimes say, without religion, society would fall apart. But look around. Many secular societies today have lower crime, higher education, better gender equality, and stronger healthcare than deeply religious ones. That's not a coincidence. When morality isn't locked under religious authority, it becomes more flexible, more compassionate, more just. And let's be clear, this isn't about attacking spirituality itself. Human beings will always ask big questions. We'll always look for meaning, for connection, for something beyond ourselves. That's natural. But what we're talking about here is different. It's about how those natural questions were hijacked, how belief systems were shaped not to elevate people, but to keep them in line. Take guilt, for example. Many religions use guilt not as a path to self-awareness, but as a leash. You sin, you confess, you obey. That cycle doesn't make people free, it makes them dependent. It keeps them focused on personal purity instead of social justice. And when people are looking down in shame instead of looking around at injustice, the ones in power stay safe. Now let's talk about the role of women in traditional religions. Over and over again, women are told to stay silent, to serve, to submit. That's not divine wisdom, it's patriarchy dressed in robes. If you study the actual structures of most major religions, women are almost always excluded from leadership. Why? Because if women were allowed to speak, to lead, to question, the entire hierarchy would start to crumble. Religions that defend caste systems, racial superiority, or divine kingship aren't just accidents. They're reflections of who held the pen when the rules were written. And those rules weren't written by gods. They were written by powerful men who had everything to lose if equality became the norm. Think about the way suffering is framed. If you're poor, you're told it's your fault or it's part of a divine plan. If you're oppressed, you're told to forgive your oppressors instead of holding them accountable. And if you resist, you're branded immoral, rebellious, or faithless. That's not morality, that's strategy. Even today, governments in many parts of the world fund religious institutions precisely because they know religion keeps people quiet. It teaches them to obey, to follow, to accept the order of things, even when that order steals their rights. Obedience becomes sacred, while resistance becomes sin. And look at how deeply this influence runs. In laws about marriage, sexuality, education, even science, you can still see the fingerprints of ancient religious authority. Policies that should be shaped by reason, evidence, and compassion are instead chained to centuries-old texts. That's not wisdom guiding society forward. That's history holding it back. Religion also deals harshly with doubt. In science, doubt is healthy. In philosophy, it's necessary. But in religion, doubt is condemned. Why? Because doubt is dangerous to power. A person who doubts asks questions. They resist easy answers. And when enough people begin to doubt, the entire system starts to crack. That's why blasphemy is still a crime in parts of the world, not because gods are offended, but because leaders are. Blasphemy laws don't protect truth. They protect authority. They exist to silence people who might disrupt the old order. And that's the real story here. Religion doesn't fear doubt because of heaven. It fears doubt because doubt breaks control. Look back at history, and you'll see how many wars were wrapped in the flag of religion. The Crusades, jihads, inquisitions, forced conversions, massacres, all of them were sold as spiritual battles. But if you peel away the sacred language, what you find underneath is land wealth, trade routes, and political dominance. Religion gave those wars moral cover. It turned conquest into something holy. It made cruelty look righteous. And it wasn't just in the Middle Ages. Whenever slavery was profitable, religion justified it. When apartheid needed defending, religion blessed it. When women demanded rights, religion told them to wait. And when oppressed people started to break free, suddenly religion became very concerned with order and tradition. But order for who? Tradition for what? This is why religious leaders are so often uncomfortable with change. Change threatens the very systems they rely on. If people stop believing they must be ruled, or that suffering is part of a divine plan, the old hierarchies begin to shake. The voices at the top grow desperate. But here's something fascinating. The most radical voices within religions have often come from below. Reformers, rebels, mystics, people who claim to hear the divine directly without going through priests or official channels. And what usually happened to them? They were silenced, exiled, sometimes even killed. Not because they lacked wisdom, but because they challenged control. It's a thread that runs through every era control. Religion, especially once institutionalized, politicized, and weaponized, has never been only about belief. It's been about power, who has it, who keeps it, and who benefits from silence. Some still claim religion is above politics. But history shows the opposite. Religion and politics have always been deeply entwined. It created hierarchies, justified conquests, and suppressed rebellions. It told people their place and called it sacred. And when someone stepped out of line, it threatened them with punishment, not just in this life, but forever. So the next time someone says a war was fought for faith, remember to ask, was it really about belief? Or was belief simply the most effective weapon? Think about how religious stories are usually told. The hero is the one who obeys without hesitation. The villain, the one who doubts, who questions, who steps outside the lines. That message gets repeated again and again. Don't challenge, don't resist, don't ask too many questions. And if you do, the punishment isn't just here and now, it's eternal. That kind of storytelling doesn't just shape behavior. It shapes identity. It teaches people that obedience is virtue while rebellion is guilt. Over time, those lessons stop being limited to temples or churches. They seep into homes, schools, and communities until they feel normal, even invisible. And the most powerful chains are always the ones you can't see. This is why so many people today still hesitate to question religious authority, even when it clashes with common sense or basic human decency. They've been trained to see doubt as weakness, to see reason as dangerous, to believe that silence is safer than speaking out. And that conditioning doesn't come by accident. It's carefully designed. Religions that last long enough to shape nations don't survive because they're the most beautiful or the most inspiring. They survive because they're useful to someone in power, someone invested in keeping things as they are. These systems evolve not to uplift the masses, but to protect those who benefit most. And in many parts of the world today, the consequences are still severe. Questioning religion isn't just unpopular, it can be illegal. People are harassed, jailed, even killed for asking the wrong questions. Not because gods are offended, but because leaders are. Blasphemy laws don't guard spiritual truth. They guard human authority. And here's the irony, the people who enforce these rigid systems often live in luxury. They wear gold, sit in palaces, and speak on behalf of gods they've never seen. Meanwhile, they tell ordinary people to accept less, to suffer quietly, to obey without question. So when you hear that religion is about humility and sacrifice, ask yourself who is really being asked to sacrifice. Because history makes it clear, the burden almost never falls on those at the top. Religions have helped powerful men shape the world in their favor and then called it sacred. They declared wars and named them holy. They defended injustice and claimed it was divine will. And every time someone pushed back, people were told to wait to have faith to obey. But there is nothing noble about submission when it only benefits those at the top. Think about it, you don't need a god to be good. You don't need a priest to tell you what's right. You don't need fear of eternal punishment to care for others. Real morality doesn't come from obedience. It comes from empathy, from reasoning, from lived experience. And yet systems of power have used fear to enforce belief for centuries. That isn't guidance, that's control. So when we look at religion as an institution, the key question isn't just, what do people believe? The real question is, who benefits from those beliefs? Who gains when obedience is praised as virtue? Who gains when questioning is forbidden? Who gains when guilt keeps people silent instead of pushing them toward justice? Because belief itself is not dangerous. People searching for meaning, for comfort, for connection, that's human. The danger comes when belief is bent, reshaped, and weaponized to serve the powerful. That's when faith stops being about wonder and starts being about control. History shows this clearly. Religions didn't just emerge naturally like wildflowers. They were cultivated, edited, and reshaped by kings, generals, lawmakers, and landowners. The ones who stood to benefit the most from loyalty without question. They weren't monks living in isolation or sages meditating on mountaintops. They were men of power using belief as strategy. And when you control belief, you don't just control people's actions, you control how they see themselves, their communities, and their place in the world. That's why religion has always been one of the strongest tools for maintaining hierarchies. It tells people their suffering has meaning. It tells them obedience is holy. It tells them rebellion is sin. So the question isn't whether religion can inspire good. It can. The real question is who designed the system and why. Notice how religious stories frame their characters. Time after time, the hero is the one who obeys without hesitation, while the villain is the one who questions or doubts. That constant repetition teaches people not just how to act, but how to think about themselves. Obedience becomes a badge of honor. Doubt becomes a mark of shame. And over centuries, that mindset spreads beyond temples and scriptures. It seeps into homes, into schools, into entire communities. It becomes invisible, just the way things are. And those are the hardest chains to break, the ones people don't even realize they're wearing. This is why so many even today hesitate to challenge religious authority. Even when they know something feels wrong, they've been taught that questioning is dangerous. That doubt is weakness. That reason must bow before faith. But none of that is an accident. It's a design. Religions that survive long enough to influence nations do so not just because they inspire wonder, but because they adapt to protect power. They evolve to reinforce the status quo. In many parts of the world right now, simply asking the wrong question about religion can get you jailed, attacked, or even killed. That's not about preserving sacred truth. That's about preserving authority. And the people who enforce that authority rarely humble. They sit on thrones where gold live in palaces. They speak in the name of gods they've never seen, all while demanding that ordinary people accept less, suffer quietly, and obey completely. Religions have often defended injustice and called it divine will. They've punished rebels and branded them sinners. They've told the oppressed to forgive instead of resist. But forgiveness without justice is just submission. And submission, when packaged as virtue, becomes a silent cage. So the real lesson is this: if obedience is being sold to you as the highest form of faith, ask yourself who benefits most from that obedience. Because history shows it's almost never the poor, the weak, or the oppressed. Look at how religion has been used to shape entire societies. When slavery was profitable, religious leaders said it was blessed. When segregation or apartheid needed defending, religion gave it holy approval. When women demanded rights, religion told them to wait. Again and again, belief was used as a shield for injustice. And notice the pattern: when people begin to break free, religion suddenly becomes very worried about order and tradition. But order for whose benefit? Tradition for whose power? The truth is, those words are often code for keeping things the way they've always been, so the people at the top can stay there. Even within religions themselves, some of the most revolutionary voices came from the bottom. Mystics, rebels, reformers, people who spoke directly to the divine without going through official channels. And how were they treated? Many were cast out, silenced, or even executed. Not because their ideas lacked merit, but because they threatened control. And that's the common thread: control. Religion, once it became institutionalized, politicized, and weaponized, wasn't just about belief anymore. It was about power. Who has it? Who keeps it? Who benefits from your silence? Some people still claim that religion is above politics. But if you study history, it's clear religion has always been politics. It built hierarchies, justified conquest, and suppressed rebellion. It told people their place in the world and called it sacred. And when someone stepped out of line, it didn't just punish them in this life, it threatened them with punishment in the next. That's not spirituality. That's a control mechanism. And once you recognize that pattern, it becomes much harder to ignore. Religion isn't dangerous because people believe in gods. It becomes dangerous when those beliefs are shaped by rulers, priests, or politicians who twist faith into obedience. So the next time you hear a leader use sacred language, don't just ask what they're saying. Ask who gains from you believing it. Because behind every holy command, there's usually someone with very earthly interests. So when we look at religion today, we can't just ask, what do people believe? We have to go deeper: who benefits from those beliefs? Because belief itself isn't the danger. The danger comes when faith is molded by power, when obedience is dressed up as holiness, and silence is sold as virtue. Think about how these systems were built. Religious texts weren't just sacred revelations, they were political edits. Councils decided what stayed, what was erased, and what was too dangerous to let survive. Rules about women, about sex, about who speaks and who stays silent, those weren't written by gods. They were written by men with a lot to lose. And over time, those edits hardened into eternal truths. But here's the reality: you don't need ancient rules to live a moral life. You don't need fear of hell to care for others. You don't need a priest to tell you what's right. Real morality comes from empathy, from reasoning, from shared human experience. Religion has often been sold as the path to freedom, but history shows it was more often a cage built from obedience, guilt, and fear. And the most dangerous part is that the cage is invisible. People believe it's their duty to stay inside. Yet there's another path. You don't have to live inside someone else's system. You don't have to carry rules designed to keep others in power. You don't have to treat political strategies from centuries ago as eternal wisdom. You can choose to question, to think, to live freely. And once you taste that freedom, the old control begins to fall apart. Because control only works when people accept it. The moment they see through it, the spell is broken. So ask yourself who really benefits from the beliefs you've been told never to question. And if the answer doesn't include you, maybe it's time to start asking better questions. If this video made you think, don't forget to subscribe. Here we're building a space for people who refuse to settle for silence. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And remember, stay curious, stay awake.